Okay. Thank you, John, for that excellent presentation on the nature of the relationship that President Kennedy had with the national security establishment and, of course, the devolving nature of that relationship. So we're now ready to move into Q&A. Keep in mind that if you have a question, please address it on the Q&A button rather than the chat button. And right now it's about 9:05 p.m. Eastern time. We need to wrap up by 9:45 to make sure that the entire presentation appears on videotape. So let's get right into it. First question from Douglas. My question pertains to part 3 about JFK in Berlin. How important was the Berlin crisis for Kennedy's policy toward Cuba and the Vietnam War?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's integral. Kennedy would not put forces in either Cuba or Southeast Asia. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So when he was shown that if even 10,000 U.S. combat forces were placed into Cuba, that we've been unable to do anything in Berlin, he was shocked. And this is what was going on. So you begin to have to ask the question, well, why were the Joint Chiefs asking to go to war with ground forces all over the place, in Europe, in Cuba, in Southeast Asia? And there can only be one answer to that. It's because they believed they were not going to have to use all those ground forces. They were assuming there was going to be a nuclear war. That's where I'm going in volume 4 now. It looks like they wanted those missiles to go into Cuba. They wanted to take out the USSR and China. And Kennedy was shocked. He said, they showed him the plan. He said, why are there all these Chinese targets in here? In this scenario, they didn't start the war. And Lemnitzer said, well, it's in the plan. So Kennedy understood that we didn't have enough he didn't intend to go to nuclear war. And so he wanted to make our ground forces stronger, but it wasn't enough, not near enough. So there was no way was he going to allow West Berlin to be sacrificed by putting troops in these other theaters. But understand this also. This was Soviet strategy. I spoke to this in my presentation at least one place. Shelepin, the Soviet KGB chief, told Khrushchev, that's how we get Berlin. You tie them down here and you tie them down there, and then they can't stop us. So from the very beginning, you cannot separate Kennedy's decisions on Vietnam policy and Cuban policy without understanding that the first plays in the center of Europe. And that's what he was defending.
Okay. Question from Will. The DRE was operational and effective inside of Cuba until they were given up to Castro by a G2 agent. This resulted in the DRE inside of Cuba becoming operationally ineffective. Many arrests resulted and essentially ended the DRE's run in Cuba. The G2 agent who gave up the entire DRE inside of Cuba was Carlos Bringuer's nephew, Jorge Medina Bringuer. What, if anything, do you make of this?
Well, it's been a long time since I looked at that, so I can't really address that. I didn't talk about that tonight. I will tell you that very quickly, Castro's forces had infiltrated his police had infiltrated all of those groups, not just the DRE. And so while some of those groups, including the DRE, could continue to be used by the CIA in Miami or elsewhere or other countries, they had no capability to use any of those groups inside of Cuba.
Okay, question from Lawrence. What does CTD refer to? John's book?
Yeah. So you had mentioned my books, and so I didn't want to take up unnecessary time, but that's a acronym for a book title, Countdown to Darkness. Okay. ITS is for Into the Storm. I didn't have enough room on the bottom of all those slides to get all that stuff in there. So watch out for those acronyms, but I give you book titles, I give you chapters, and I give you page ranges to, if you would like, to pursue and look at all these slides again, because there's stuff on them that I didn't have time to mention, but they're all there for people to pursue in their own time.
Okay, Stuart says, why did the CIA want to sabotage President Kennedy so much?
Well, it's difficult question because we think of the CIA and even the Pentagon as being monolithic, and they're really not. Uh, John McCone didn't certainly do, want to do that, but a lot of people did, a lot of senior people, and I'm working on that real hard right now. Um, it's clear to me that Lemnitzer, he had it in for Kennedy from the beginning. Didn't like him. I've collected a lot of his statements. Some of them were private about Kennedy's inexperience and why he wasn't fit to be president. Um, and there are many other generals that I'm looking at in Volume 4. Some of the way high up in the Pentagon, but the Pentagon is not the answer itself. It's the military. We've got military all over the place, not just in the Pentagon. The head of the uh, uh, National Security Agency has to be a military man, and the deputy has to be civilian, and it's the other way around in the CIA. So you have spread throughout all of these uh, organizations, military officers whose real loyalty is not to that organization; it's to their service, or even smaller, to the people they went you know, uh, to school with, and so Taylor and Lemnitzer and Carter and those guys, they were all on the same team. They didn't like Kennedy, and so I wouldn't say it's the entire CIA. And when we talk about the assassination, by the way, which I am not really going to get to that till Volume 5, because that's late 1963. But I said in the very beginning, way back in Volume 1, in my list of hypotheses and assumptions, that I felt that um, one thing the CIA was certainly involved in at a very high level, Angleton, the counterintelligence chief in particular, fixed Oswald's files, wouldn't allow all the stuff that he had been doing in New Orleans and Mexico City to go into his official CIA 201 file. They were hidden. And so when Kennedy was assassinated on 11/22/63, and everybody went running down the hallways to open up the triple combination safes, there those documents were. And they tried to destroy them. They panicked. And there was it was a long time before we actually got those files, because people, to protect themselves, had been making their own copies in their desk drawers. So we eventually got multiple copies of all the Oswald files that had been pigeonholed. So the idea of not letting that come out before the assassination, if it had, they would have taken Oswald. The FBI would have taken Oswald off the parade route. But somebody turned off the switch on him, and so that's where we're going here. The CIA played a very active role before the assassination in setting things up so that it would panic at the secret level people into thinking that we'd almost started World War III. And in order to stop World War III, and Earl Warren believed this, he cooperated. But so what hasn't happened yet is that we haven't really been able to talk about where is the galactic center of this conspiracy. And there is where I mentioned the name Vesiana. I didn't try and get into it, but that he was one of several great misdirections that have been going on for years that we need to dispense with, which I did in Volume 3, which is why it was a book that opened up things and put us into a new place. But for some reason, the Pentagon and the military has been getting a pass all these years in our researchers. You don't see hardly anybody. I remember a guy called John Judge, whose mother worked in the Pentagon, and he used to talk about it, but I'm amazed. All the transcripts of all the Joint Chiefs of Staff's personal meetings, not with other organizations, but their own daily or weekly meetings from 1945 to 1978 have been destroyed. They're gone. And if that had happened at the top of the CIA, if all the top CIA meetings from the time of its creation until 1978 had been destroyed, you'd hear people screaming from the rafters, why do these generals get a pass? And so I think that what's happening in my works, this as we move forward through these volumes, is we're beginning to see that there is it's in the military. But if you just say it's the Pentagon, you're putting everybody into that box, and you shouldn't do that. Well, what about somebody like Limnitz? He's not even in the Pentagon anymore. He's over there in Europe. So that's why I say that it appears to me that and it's a hypothesis for right now, but it looks like that's the direction I'm moving in anyway. I'm finding the center of this galaxy, of this conspiracy, is located in the military. By the way, they kill people better than the CIA does. But with assistance from elements of the CIA.
Okay. Stuart asks, was Kennedy perceived to be a threat to world domination plans?
Yeah, that's easy. Yes.
Okay. John asks, by coincidence, I myself also happen to be a Cold War veteran and fellow military intel vet as well, Marine Corps. Question. The Communist Party of North Vietnam, like that of many other communist countries, was divided into two main factions, one pro-Soviet, Ho Chi Minh, and the other Maoist, Le Duan. It has now been revealed that between 23 to 24 November 63, there occurred a coup that removed Ho from power and replaced him with the more militant Le Duan. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it says interesting. I don't know about that coup. I have no information about it, but I know that for a long time, the North Vietnamese Communist Party was actually trying to play Moscow off against Beijing so that they could get weapons and support from both of them. So yes, there were factions, of course, in that party, the Le Duan party.
All right. Charlie asks, I understand why JFK was presented with rosy numbers about the operation in Vietnam, but why was it important for LBJ to be provided the real and accurate numbers?
Okay, I'm writing a lot about this now in Volume 4. I spent a lot of time down at the LBJ library getting a huge amount of material, all the Burris memos to his boss. So the short answer is that it was Burris's job to prepare LBJ to take over the job. And that preparation is going on early on. And I had several interviews with Burris in the late 80s. We had at least a half a dozen meetings, and he gave me a lot of good stuff that I put in JFK Invented about that order of battle deception and how he got the memos and he got the information and sent these memos to LBJ. But what he was telling me was LBJ was telling him what to do. And from the very beginning, he told me that LBJ had pulled him off an oil rig way back in the 40s and ordered him to go into war in Europe. And then when LBJ became vice president, and Burris was he's in CIA at the time, running agent nets in Switzerland, LBJ ordered me to come back. So LBJ says, jump, and Burris jumps. But actually what you find when you go through all of the files, not people's books, but all the files, Burris tells LBJ what to do. And LBJ says, well, all right, Howard, if that's the way you want it, and he's drunk half the time. And so Burris's job is to make sure that he's fully informed, and he is. And it's not just on Vietnam. When you look at every day, Burris has all the straight skinny, and everybody else who's reporting directly to Kennedy through the National Security Council is only proposing things to the president that they want him to do. They're not just giving him the news, whatever's happening. LBJ is getting unfettered, true stuff across the board on every issue around the world. Whether or not he even bothered to remember it or read it is another question, but that's what was going on. Now, by the time we get to close to the assassination, Burris is gone. He leaves. He's done his job, and he's out of the country, going back over to Europe. He's hiding over there for a while, and he's talking to I forget the name of it, LBJ's top aide at the time, Jenkins was his name. And so Burris is now coaxing Jenkins and telling him how to handle LBJ, telling him what to do and making sure he doesn't, say the wrong thing. And so that's what I think is going on with this back channel. The importance of LBJ knowing what's actually happening is to put him into a position. If he has to take over, he'll do what he's supposed to do.
Okay, Howard asks, why wasn't Lemnitzer fired, or was he?
No, it technically, it's both. In other words, Kennedy could have, if he had wanted to, extended him as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he was due to be rotated out of that job. So technically, he had to go somewhere. Okay, now it's really clear that Kennedy wanted to get rid of him, did not know what was going on in Europe with these secret armies, and was afraid. He was afraid of the Joint Chiefs. He was particularly afraid of Lemnitzer. And that's why President Kennedy, when he read the book, 7 Days in May, suggested to the authors that they do a movie using the White House. And so the 7 Days, it's an interesting film to watch. It's pretty close to what looks like might have happened had there been a coup. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Kennedy didn't just, what he should have done. Obviously, the questioner is certainly perceptive. He should have just fired him. He should have not even allowed him to finish his service time into 63. He should have just, in fact, he should have fired them all at the beginning, way back, and he never did that. Why did he let all those generals stay for a whole year afterwards? He was picking off one here, picking off one there. He should have cleaned the place out and put his own folks in. And so it bit him in, he got bit in the end by not taking the bull by the horns and putting reliable people in place early on in the CIA and the Pentagon.
Okay, Jim says, if the invasion of Cuba was such a central issue, why did the U.S. not invade Cuba once JFK was out of the way?
By that point, it was all about Vietnam. And there's another point too. So this whole idea of killing Castro becomes very interesting once you get into whatever you think the plot is. And I'm not talking about forensics and all that type of stuff. But the World War III plot that Oswald was working for Castro and the KGB requires that Castro has to be alive after the assassination. If he's dead, he can't be the one who's behind the operation. So when you look at the anti-Castro operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, almost 90% of them that have anything to do with Cuban policy are for assassinating Castro. But there's a smaller group of them that look like they do, but they don't want to give Rolando Cubela, who was a defector in the summer of 62, they don't want to give him a rifle with a scope. He's already killed people. And so I'm moving towards the idea that there's a group that knew that Kennedy was going to die, that wanted to make sure Castro was alive and didn't want an invasion. Now, they could have, if they wanted to invade Cuba and get away with it, and with the plot I'm talking about, then they would have done that maybe in 64 or 65. But by that time, we are up to Viet Cong and our eyeballs. And Westmoreland's getting to the point where he asks LBJ, can I use tactical nuclear weapons, to pour chestnuts out of the fire here? So I think it's inconceivable after 65 or 66 that we're going to be invading Cuba with what was happening in Vietnam.
Okay, Charlotte asks, what's a false flag operation?
It means to pull. Now, the Gladio folks were doing this, and that was what Lemnitzer was trying to do. What it means is to do something and make it look like somebody else did it. In particular, with the Gladio units, they wanted to make it look like the communists. They would go shoot people, murder them, and say, oh, look at those bad communists. They murdered, and it wasn't at all. So in the Northwoods case, the idea was that Lemnitzer wanted us to sink one of our ships at Guantanamo, wanted us to kill some people in Miami, some Americans, and also in Washington, D.C. to shoot some people fleeing Cuba in boats, and then to trick the American people into thinking that Castro had done all that, and therefore they would want us to go to war in Cuba. That's a false flag operation. In other words, it's like a metaphor. Is that your dog wanting to go outside?
No, she's hears something.
Okay.
She's protecting me. So,
well, anyway, false flag operation is to do something that you don't want people to know who really did it, and that way you can make believe that this group did it or that group did it. But what it means is it's certainly not true.
Okay. Alan asked, could you describe in what ways your new series on the Kennedy presidency and his assassination evolved from one volume to the next?
Sure. Volume 1. By the way, I need to include also JFK in Vietnam, because as this evolution of the multi-volume series is going along, all of a sudden the second edition of JFK in Vietnam works into this. But I started in Volume 1 just going back to the 50s, even into the late 40s, and started watching some of the characters that show up at the end of our story, making sure I'm following Phillips and others, and Harvey and so on. So the first volume was like going back to square one. Volume 2 was to take a very close look at the transition between the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration. And there were some real shockers there. I did not understand Eisenhower. I thought I did. I thought he was a nice guy. He gave us that famous speech when he's actually, cooking up a Cold War triple play in order to get Castro. So it was Volume 3 that changed everything. There were really 3 huge deceptions that have been going on for years. One was Yuri Nosenko. Now, not everybody knows about this story, but he was a Soviet KGB false defector who came over to our side in '62 in Geneva, and then later, after the Kennedy assassination, defected for real and went to the United States. His mission was to conceal what the KGB was doing with Oswald in the Soviet Union when he was there. Number 2 was this guy Vesiana was talking about. He's an anti-Castro Cuban exile who wanted to kill Castro, but that's not the real story. The real story is that he got put in jail for cocaine trafficking, and he was used during the investigations by the Church Committee and the House Select Committee in order to make it look to conceal the role of the Pentagon and the chiefs. That's what that was for. I'm not going to go through all the. It's, like I said, it's on my website. You can look at it, a long presentation I've done. But and the third one was a CIA staff officer. His name was Sam Halpern. He worked for Bill Harvey in the Cuban task force, but he didn't know that Harvey was the one who was actually working with the mafia to get an assassination plot going against Castro. And Halpern thought Bobby Kennedy, or he wanted to think Bobby Kennedy was the one who was behind that. And he spent the rest of his life, all the way up to like almost 2000, insisting that Bobby Kennedy was the one who was behind that, got his brother killed, and almost started World War III. So when you take these 3, you got a Cuban, you got a Russian, and an American, and they're being used for reasons, many different reasons, to give us a scenario that is not true. And it screws up everything. Some of the stuff was laid from the 70s was laid in over 62 and 63. So when you remove all that false, what do you end up with? In a brand new place, it's like an orchard. You're all alone in it with low hanging fruit everywhere you look. You turn this way or that way, and there it is. It's easy to see what really happened when you remove all the false stories. And that's what volume 3 did. And and I realized that as I began to work my way through Mongoose and the approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis, boy, I needed some time off. I didn't know what I was talking about. And so I've spent 27 months already seeing where the story is leading me now. And I've got the rest of this year. So it's going to end up being a 3-year project to pick up where I left off in volume 3 and finish the job in volume 4. Now, the same thing could be said about JFK in Vietnam, because what's happening in volume 3 is all of a sudden Taylor's looking like a bad guy. He's doing stuff that Kennedy told him not to do. And he was controlling Vietnam policy under Kennedy as his military aide. Well, after he came back and with a proposal to send combat troops to Vietnam under a flood release task force cover, Kennedy got really angry and he lost control of Vietnam. And that's why Kennedy fired everybody and McNamara took over and the SecDef conferences began to happen. So anyway, I'll stop on Taylor. I could go on probably for another 10, 15 minutes as I keep dot after dot after dot. And so, and it's not just Taylor. All of a sudden, Harvey, I'm finding the stuff out about him going way back to all the work he did with safecrackers and assassins going way back. And then after he was in Berlin and just before he comes to the CIA, he takes this long trip all over Europe and hangs out with all these bad guys. And he ends up in, guess where? In Italy, in Rome, as the case officer at a key point in this whole story. So anyway, I guess that's enough for now. Finding out, exposing, and overturning misdirections is what we need to do before we're ever going to know who was really behind this thing. I'm not talking about who's shooting. I'm talking about who was actually had figured it out, what group, what nucleus was really at the center of this whole thing. I can't hear you.
Sorry, muted myself. John wants to know if Operation Gladio is going to be covered in your volume 4. Yes.
Well, we've got a lot more to do. I only showed a few slides just to give you a taste of. It's an awful story. It's a really awful story. A lot of people were murdered and killed, and I would say a couple of things. Two areas that I'm going to really be pursuing more are going to be the importance of the Vatican, or actually the relationship between the Vatican and the CIA and narcotics trafficking. And there's going to be a whole lot more detail on the CIA officers who came forward on camera, even though the agency will never admit it. It hasn't and won't. But senior officers have actually now gone on camera and said what they knew was happening. And so there's going to be at least one chapter 3, if not a second one, somewhere in volume 4.
Okay. Bob says, was Vietnam purely a means to an end, a starting point for escalation to full nuclear war with China and USSR, or an end unto itself, a protracted war that would benefit the military industries and suppliers?
Well, there's no doubt that the military suppliers were happy with all the money they were making off that war. There's no question about that. But I think I would superimpose the first part of the question on Laos and all of Southeast Asia, because that's where it's Straight to the Brink over Laos is a chapter in JFK in Vietnam, very early in the book. And yeah, they want, some of those chiefs wanted war. They wanted war. They wanted nuclear, especially LeMay. He said, look, they're not going to attack us if we go into Laos, but if they do, we'll just nuke them. And he said, by the way, why don't we get our good friend Chiang Kai-shek over there in Taiwan to attack Hainan Island, and it will take out China too. Yeah, that's actually in in the record. That was LeMay's response. So yeah, he saw, and his successor at the Strategic Air Command, they wanted nuclear war. They wanted it back in the late 50s, and they wanted it in the early 60s, and that's what we almost what almost happened. But I wouldn't say that Vietnam was the starting point for that. It was Laos. The only nuclear aspect of the Vietnam War was at the very end. We were in such bad shape that General Westmoreland, our commander of MACV over there, actually asked President Johnson to authorize the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam.
And who was LeMay?
Oh, General LeMay had for the longest time been the chief of the chief of the SAC, Strategic Air Command, and then later on after that he became the Air Force Chief of Staff.
Okay, Mike says, how do you think that the Joint Chiefs at this time interpreted NSD 68? Do you think their intention was just to defend against communism, but to banish it around the globe, and that JFK's move to coexist was at odds with their plans?
I think I wouldn't include all the generals in this. There are some that weren't quite that rabid, but most of them were, yes, to banish communism all over the world. And it wasn't just generals, by the way. At that time, when you get back into the 50s, you'll find a whole bunch of folks over there in the State Department that are just as rabid anti-communists as a lot of the military officers were. Scary.
Okay, scrolling through, trying to pick out the ones that I want to ask. Great presentation. Had you been a military advisor or trusted influence to President Kennedy, I think you've already sort of answered this, what would you have done differently than his advisors? What, if anything, could have been done while maintaining his policies to avoid him being overthrown? Besides the obvious, who should have been fired or replaced? Who should he have trusted that might have changed the outcome of his presidency? How could Kennedy have survived at that time and place? Or is that a complete impossibility in your opinion?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. I've already said that I think he did put a whole new team in place for economics and foreign policy and all that stuff. He didn't touch the military. He didn't touch the CIA. He should have done that early on, especially after the Bay of Pigs. Let's say, okay, maybe he didn't do it. I personally would have told him to get rid of him right away, but after the Bay of Pigs, that would have been it for me. And I would have been on that bandwagon right away. But then if we move downstream, it was the worst thing in the world to go after the Castro brothers again. There was nothing had changed. It was only worse, much, much worse. More Soviet weapons were in there. There were no viable groups on the island to do anything with. And so it was just a revenge thing. And it's unlike Kennedy's intellect. And Bobby was really rabid about it too. But yeah, I would have said no. Just like Galbraith. Galbraith was right. He was ambassador to India, by the way. Very smart guy, one of the smartest economists that did help Kennedy set up all the economic stuff before he sent him over to India to be the ambassador. But yeah, he got it right. I mean, we're squandering all of our power down there. It doesn't doing us any good, and doing the other side a lot of good, because we're tied down, getting nowhere.
Okay, Scott says, when Bill Harvey was sent to Rome, was that with the stay behind Operation Gladio specifically in mind for him to play a part?
No, they were just there. He was sent, but I believe that, and we had other people that had been there too. Bill Colby, who became the head of the CIA, he was there for a long time. But Bill Harvey liked what he saw. He endorsed the strategy of tension that was going on very actively in '63. But he was sent over there to get him away from the CIA because, they were he was lucky he didn't get just fired completely. So after Bobby fired him from the task force in the summer of '62. Actually, it's in October of '62. They like kind of hide. He hides they hide him in the basement for a while. He doesn't go to Rome until I guess it's the spring of 1963. So he's down there, just they're giving him some make work. And then and it's Helms, by the way, who's protecting him. And Helms is another guy on my radar screen. When I say I'm gonna have much more to say about somebody, that's my way of saying it's gonna be bad. And Helms is one of those guys. Helms and Burris were very close, for example. But so Helms protected Harvey and gave him a chief of staff position. No, excuse me, a chief of station position in Rome. And it doesn't get any bigger than that, because that's where the Vatican is. That's where a lot of the Gladio stuff is going on. And it's getting hotter and hotter, by the way, in Italy. More assassinations of political leaders going all the way up into the 60s. And so I think that NATO, in the form of Lemitzer, is not against that. If he was against it, he wouldn't have let it happen. And especially Harvey over there, it's a witch's brew. And yeah, so I'm not done looking at Harvey yet. There's a lot of other things about what he was doing in the summer of '62. I don't want to take up too much time. There's probably some more questions here we could field.
Well, let's just wrap it up with one last question, and that's by me. We just have a few minutes left. What was the extent of President Kennedy's knowledge of Gladio?
Zero.
Okay. That's a nice, succinct way to wrap up our presentation this evening. John, thank you very much. It's been absolutely excellent. Just what we had in mind as we developed this conference in a thematic way. Want to remind you all that we've got Jefferson Morley is going to be giving the next two presentations. We are adding 2 additional speakers on the medical evidence part of this conference, so it's going to be extending into May. Be sure to mark your calendar. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. And John, thank you so much again. It was great.
Thanks for inviting me. Enjoyed it.
On that note, we'll sign off. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of the Future of Freedom Foundation.